Sarah had only recently moved into the old house. It was spacious, charming, and the rent was unbelievably low. At first, everything seemed perfect. But on the third night, she woke up suddenly, her heart racing. In the stillness of the night, she heard it, a faint whisper coming from beneath her bed. She held her breath, listening closely. The whisper grew louder, like someone calling her name, echoing from the darkness below. Sarah clenched her blanket tightly, her pulse quickening as an unsettling feeling crept over her. The next day, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. While washing dishes in the kitchen, Sarah felt a strange presence behind her, as though unseen eyes were observing her every move. She glanced nervously at the reflection in the window, half expecting to see something lurking. But there was nothing there. That night, the whispers returned, louder than before. A shuffling sound came from under her bed, and her breath caught in her throat. She reached for her phone, turning on the flashlight, but when she looked under the bed, only shadows. On the fourth night, it was different. Sarah woke in the dead of night, paralyzed by an overwhelming weight on her chest. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her eyes darted around the room, and that's when she saw it. A dark, twisted figure slowly emerging from beneath her bed. Its limbs bent at impossible angles as it crawled closer, and Sarah could only watch in horror, frozen in place. The figure rose, towering over her, casting a monstrous shadow on the wall. Terrified, Sarah decided to confront the landlady the next morning. She explained the strange events, her voice trembling with fear. The landlady listened quietly before sighing. "You're not the first," she said grimly. "A boy used to live here. He was last seen playing under his bed. He vanished without a trace, and some say the house took him." Sarah's skin prickled as the landlady's words echoed in her mind. There was something more to this house, something far darker than she had ever imagined. That night, Sarah packed her things, determined to leave. As she stood by the door, ready to escape, a cold sensation washed over her. The shadows behind her seemed to deepen, crawling towards her like fingers of darkness. She froze, heart pounding, and glanced back at the house one last time. The wall near her bed had something she hadn't noticed before. A message scratched into the wall. "You can leave, but you'll never escape." The words were a warning, a promise that no one truly leaves. Sarah had moved to a new apartment, trying to forget the terrifying nights in the old house. But the shadow she thought she had left behind seemed to follow her. One evening, while she was sitting on the couch in her new living room, she thought she saw a familiar shadow flicker in the corner of her eye. Shaking her head, she tried to dismiss it as exhaustion, but the uneasy feeling of being watched lingered in the air. The next day, Sarah started receiving strange phone calls. Each time she picked up, there was only a faint whisper on the other end, distant and unsettling. At first, she thought it was a prank, but the calls kept coming, each one more disturbing than the last. The whisper reminded her of the old house, and soon she couldn't shake the growing panic inside her. One morning, after a particularly restless night, Sarah woke up to find something strange written on the bathroom mirror. In thin lines, as if traced by a finger, were the words, "You can't escape." She stared at the message in horror, her heart pounding as the memories of the shadow from the old house flooded back. How could this be happening here, in her new apartment? Desperate for answers, Sarah visited a psychologist who suggested a deep sleep therapy session to uncover the root of her fears. During the session, Sarah found herself back in the old house. In her dream, the shadow under the bed was clearer now, growing larger and more defined. It reached out for her, and Sarah felt an overwhelming sense of helplessness as the darkness began to consume her. After the session, Sarah woke up in her apartment, but something wasn't right. Objects in her room seemed slightly out of place. Books scattered on the floor, the chair in the corner slightly turned. The shadows in the room seemed to move on their own, creeping along the walls. She realized that whatever had followed her from the old house was still with her, lurking in the dark, refusing to let her go. Sarah had been living in fear for weeks. Every night, the shadow grew stronger, and she could feel it creeping closer. Tonight was no different. Lying in bed, her eyes wide open, she felt the cold air brush against her skin. Her heart raced as the shadows in the corner of the room began to shift. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure was there, looming over her, its form dark and menacing. Sarah lay frozen, unable to move, her mind consumed by the fear of what was coming next. Desperate for answers, Sarah had begun researching the old house's dark history. She discovered stories of families who had disappeared, whispers of curses and strange happenings. But one name stood out, the story of a young boy who vanished, leaving behind nothing but a trail of shadows. The more she uncovered, the more the terror gripped her heart. In her new home, Sarah hoped she had escaped the shadow, but the cold breath of fear lingered. Every corner, every dark space felt dangerous. The shadow had followed her. It wasn't just a house curse, it was her curse. One night, as she tried to leave, the door slammed shut, trapping her. The shadow was there, growing larger, surrounding her. She could feel it, feeding off her fear, becoming more powerful with every moment. But Sarah had had enough. She stood her ground, staring into the depths of the darkness. "I'm not afraid of you," she whispered. The shadow seemed to hesitate, flickering for a moment. Sarah took a step forward, her fear replaced by determination. "I'm not afraid anymore," she repeated, her voice stronger. The shadow shrank, its form becoming weaker, less threatening. The room began to brighten as the darkness receded. Sarah had won, but the cost had been her peace of mind. Weeks later, Sarah had moved again, far from the nightmare of her old life. But even in her new home, she could still feel it. A shadow lurking in the corners, a whisper in the dark. She had fought it before, and she knew she could do it again. But the fear never truly left, because once you've been claimed by the shadow, it never really lets you go.